Hi, I'm Roger Nelson. Glad to see everybody in this sort of technological wonder of Zoom. I want to talk today about what I think is really breakthrough evidence for what I'm thinking of as global consciousness. I'll get into this a little bit more later, but there are different ways of explaining results in the project I've been running for more than 2 decades now. But I'll start with a very tiny introduction. We have shown in the laboratory that intention can affect the output of a random number generator. And miniaturizing such RNGs and taking them out into the field, we're able to test whether group consciousness might also affect these random number generators. And again, we have a positive answer there. However, group consciousness is defined. What we seem to need in that experiment for there to be an effect is a kind of coherence within the group. Now, that work led to thinking about mass consciousness, about global consciousness. So in the first prototype, or actually a second prototype of this experiment that now has been running for more than 20 years, I asked people to collect data on their random number generators, anybody who was doing that kind of experimentation. So I had 12 independent data lines, put them all together, and you see in this picture the red line, which is goes outside of an envelope of indicating it's improbable. It should be just a level trace, but this is 1 in 100 odds that we would get so much deviation. So that was encouraging to do that kind of research, ad lib, but quite successful. So we decided to build a global network. This picture shows where we have had instruments located all over the world, not all at one time, but up to about 75 of them when the network was its biggest. This was a little bit like an electroencephalogram, EEG, but for the Earth, for Gaia. So we called it an electrogaiagram, and that created the name EGG. And we'll come back to the analogy at some later point. Now, in the formal experiment, the GCP tests a grand overall hypothesis that's a little bit vague. That hypothesis is that when people come together or are brought together in a strong emotional resonance by events in the world, we will see deviations from expectation in the data from our GCP random number generator network. So making this into a formal experiment required setting a very refined and specific hypothesis for each event. And ultimately, our formal experiment had 500 events. So basically, this is 500 replication experiments. The timing, the beginning and the end of the event are specified. The analysis we do is specified, all before anybody saw the data. And we predict a positive deviation of network variance, which is the measure that we typically use. It amounts to something like a correlation between these widely separated devices that are out in the world. And the cumulative deviation plot we often use for displaying data like this should be a random walk, which means something that wanders level across the screen or across the graph. In our tests, about 75% or 70% show departures in the direction that we predicted. That's highly unusual. And they are always, that deviation is correlated with mass attention events. Something like 20% of those events were significant at the 5% level. The bottom line, over the 17 years that it took to assemble the 500 well-defined global events, produced a 7 sigma deviation, 7 z-scores 7 standard deviations away from what's expected. That turns into odds against chance of this explaining this deviation on the order of 1 trillion to 1, maybe 3 trillion to 1. Here's a different picture of exactly the same data. The red line here is the cumulative deviation trace showing the accumulation across time of all those small deviations for each individual experiment. Ups and downs, but basically a trend that really shouldn't be there. The gray cloud of data shows what we think of as controls, simulations and resampling. Now, beyond this primary finding of a highly significant departure from expectation using this network variance or intercorrelation measure, what else? What else is there? What else shows structure in the data? And I'll show you a few examples. Effect sizes, turns out, are proportional to the number of people that are engaged, which is probably about the same thing as saying how important is the event. That's a highly significant effect. We found an analysis done by Peter Bancel that when people are awake, there's more of a contribution to global consciousness. There's a bigger effect when people are awake than when they're asleep. This shouldn't be surprising, but we're talking now not about individuals, but about a kind of global consciousness, a mass consciousness. A lot of our events, indeed probably most of them, evoke some kind of emotion, and the strength of that emotion, no matter whether it's positive or negative valence, the strength of the emotion is a highly significant determinant of the effect size in the experiment. The list could be made longer, or it is longer, but I want to talk about independent, external analysis done by people who were not involved in the original analysis of the data. Ulf Holmberg is an economist from Stockholm, and he decided he would look at the data to see whether there might be any relationship of GCP data to the stock market. I'll show you figures later. He did the same kind of thing, asking whether Google search terms would be correlated with the GCP data. And Dean Radin took a much more abstract approach and asked whether the deviations occur only during the events or if it's more generally distributed in the data. Now, both of these people have presentations in this conference, so check them out. They'll have a lot more refined and deeper analysis of what what I'm introducing here. Ulf looked at the stock market, and in particular looked at returns on day trades, asking what kind of a strategy produces some wind. A passive investment strategy didn't amount to much. That's the sort of horizontal line at the bottom. And up from that a little bit, you can see the GCP Z index computed by Ulf from GCP data, which are publicly available on my website. In any case, the Z index, it looks like it would be wise to pay attention. It produces substantial results, not quite as much as the an adaptive index that has to do with what's actually going on in individual trades. Anyway, the point is that in this simulation, at least, it makes sense, it would make sense to use GCP data to decide on what kind of trade you're going to make. Here's a picture of Ulf's analysis of the Google search index. He created an index out of the most popular search terms and on a monthly basis. And this plot shows the global search index he created over a period of some 6 or 7 years, from 2014 to the present, basically. And superimposed is the monthly filtered average Z-score from the GCP data. If you look at this, probably almost everybody will say, yeah, that looks pretty well correlated. And it is. It's significantly correlated. Here's a more sharply focused version of the same kind of analysis. He asked, what happens to, what kind of correlation might there be between searches for corona, this term that we now associate with the COVID-19 pandemic? Does that correlate with GCP average z-scores? And the answer is yes, indeed, it does. You can see in the left-hand figure, it's very obviously and clearly correlated. In the right-hand figure, the same data are presented in a different way. And again, there's a strong and clear, significant correlation between GCP z-scores, the composite z-scores on a daily or monthly basis, and what happens in the Google search index. So moving on to Dean Radin's work, one of the two things that he did to ask the question whether there's kind of a general reduction or of entropy or neg entropy induction in the GCP data, he made chunks of data representing 8 days or 10 days, 15, 20 days, and looked at data from the whole 23 years using fairly sophisticated kind of calculation called multi-scale entropy analysis. And you look at this curve, what looks like a dotted curve, that's 3 different data sets superimposed. The original data, which are represented by black dots, that same data but scrambled randomly, represented as white circles, and pseudo-random data. And all 3 of them look very much alike until you magnify the scale. In the inset, you can see that the original data in the black dot is very different from the 2 control, we might call them control conditions, highly significant difference. This means that the original data has a generalized neg entropy in it, whereas the scrambled or pseudo-random data don't show that kind of negentropic trend. In another way of looking at the same general question, he asked if the GCP data might be composed of a lot of different chunks of random sequences. And to do this, he made the data into chunks and then looked for the largest value and the smallest value, the maxima and minima within the chunks, and then did a circular shift of all the data around the maximum point, leaving a kind of what looks like a smooth line with 2 very big peaks in the middle. This is kind of an artificial peak, and once those are removed, you see in the second B line here, the z-scores as a kind of random distribution in the vertical space. A couple of more stages in the analysis use smoothing to find out if there's any structure in the data. The lowest line shows the difference between the maxima and minima, and you can see that that peaks around the point where the maximum value was, and then the degree or the size of the z-scores diminishes as you go away from that point, which means very straightforwardly that there is temporal structure in the data, and there shouldn't be because it's supposed to be random data. Now, I also have been doing some other work, looking at the data in different ways from the original or primary GCP analysis. And something that intrigued me was what's done in EEG work when people are looking at brain responses to stimuli, what's called evoked response potentials. This is a picture of what a typical brainwave looks like when you do a lot of summation and smoothing to get rid of the noise, basically. The brain is a noisy system. What you see is a large peak in the center and smaller peaks of the opposite sign on both sides of the nominal event, the stimulus that causes the brain to do something. Now, it turns out, of course, it's possible to apply this to GCP data. We usually use that cumulative deviation trace. And the upper left-hand picture shows all the significant 6-hour events in the database. That is to say, we're highly selecting a very small number of the best representations of what's going on. And this produces a curve with a sharp incline between the two vertical lines that define the event. Outside of that, there's a kind of buildup, it looks like, so that before we even think that there is an event, the Global Consciousness Project the data seem to be changing a little bit. And then after that, it looks just like a random walk. In the right-hand, upper right, is the raw data. In the lower left is smoothing of that raw data. You begin to see some structure in it. This is a 15-minute window run across the raw data. And that's further smoothed in the lower right-hand corner with a 60-minute moving average. And you can see, I think, what looks very much like an evoked potential. In other words, there's a kind of indication that there's a stimulus, produces a large effect in the data, a peak that's surrounded by smaller peaks of the opposite sign. Indicative, interesting, but not definitive. Peter Benzel did a similar kind of cumulative deviation analysis of all the short events. You had to do a lot of manipulation to get them to fit into into the rubric he wanted, which was to be able to combine them all. He stretched those that were shorter into 24-hour events, and then plotted the resulting cumulative deviation trace. And this he did in service of suggesting that an experimenter effect or an observer effect would select the starting point and end points of our events in such a way as to produce the result. That's one of the two primary theories or models that people use to try to explain these data. I took the data apart, deconvolved it, and created basically the raw data from which the cumulative deviation was produced, and plotted that as a smooth epoch average in the same way that is done for brain evoked response data. And what you see looks ever so much like one of those ERPs, the evoked response pattern from now not a single human brain, but from a global consciousness. So I'm thinking that we have a good deal of what might be construed as breakthrough evidence. Is the kind of thing that will help us figure out what is going on. How should we explain this data? And both internal and external correlates to the GCP data point to global consciousness as the common factor across all kinds of structure in the GCP data, and ultimately with meaningful correlation with human activity. Now that was a fairly high-speed scan through a lot of interesting possibilities. I will be interested to listen to and hopefully be able to answer questions if people want to come around to the discussion room. Thank you very much.